Hello and thank you for downloading. My name's Steve Johnson, and this is the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Hello and welcome to Inquests and Inquiries. Today's episode is on the Redfern Inquiry, which was about human tissue analysis in UK nuclear facilities. The documents that I provided the AI with detail the Redfern Inquiry, which investigated the removal and analysis of human tissue from diseased workers at UK nuclear facilities, primarily Sellafield, between 1961 and 1992. The inquiry explored the ethical and legal implications of these practices, focusing on consent, or lack of, coronial procedures, and the involvement of organisations like British Nuclear Fuels Limited, the UK Atomic Energy Authority, and the National Radiological Protection Board. A key concern was whether families were informed about organ removal and how analysis results were used, particularly in compensation claims and scientific research. The inquiry examined the roles of coroners, pathologists, trade unions, and management in these procedures. Ultimately, the inquiry aimed to assess the legality, ethics, and transparency of tissue analysis within the UK nuclear industry during this period. I now hand you over to our artificial intelligence podcasters.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're diving into something pretty dark, post-mortem organ analysis in the UK nuclear industry.
Yeah.
From like the 50s to the 90s.
Right.
And our main source here is going to be the Redfern Inquiry report, which really dug deep into this whole thing after it caused a lot of controversy. And just to set the stage a little bit for everyone, we're not just talking about scientific research here. This is also about potential legal claims from workers.
Yeah, exactly. It's that intersection of science and potential legal battles that made this whole thing so ethically complex.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump right in with a case that really kind of threw me.
Okay.
Edward McMullen, he worked at Sellafield, but his death wasn't even related to radiation. He had a fatal head injury at home, but they still removed organs during his postmortem. I mean, why?
Yeah, that's one of those cases that really shows you just how blurry the lines were and how much they lacked clear procedures. I mean, the pathologist who did it claimed the coroner knew about the organ removal, but then the coroner denied any knowledge. So right away, you've got this breakdown in communication and oversight.
It's almost like they just assumed, well, he worked at a nuclear facility, so might as well take the organs. But doing that without a clear connection to radiation exposure just seems so ethically wrong.
Absolutely. And this case kind of gets at this bigger issue with measuring internal radiation exposure while a worker is still alive. You know, external radiation is like a sunburn. You can see how bad it is based on how strong it was and how long they were exposed. But internal exposure is way trickier. It's like if someone swallowed something radioactive, how do you really know how much damage is being done?
So they relied on stuff like urine tests to estimate how much radiation a worker had absorbed.
Yeah, they had formulas like the Langham formula that tried to connect the amount of radioactive material in their urine to how much was still inside their body.
Right.
But it's kind of like trying to guess how much poison someone drank based on what comes out later. Not the most reliable method, especially years after the fact.
I see. So that's why postmortem analysis seemed so important, I guess, from a scientific perspective. At least then they could get a real answer about how much radiation these workers had actually accumulated.
Exactly. Analyzing organs like lungs, liver, and bone, those are where radioactive elements tend to build up. So researchers could get much more accurate data. And at Sellafield, they use some pretty intense techniques, dissolving the ash of organs in acid and using all this specialized equipment to measure the radioactivity. But then the question becomes, was the science worth the ethical cost?
Right, because it sounds like the laws around all this were pretty murky. Was it even legal to just take these organs without getting permission from the families?
Well, the laws at the time were definitely complex. The Coroners Act of 1887 and all the changes made to it later on gave coroners the power to order postmortems, especially in cases where they suspected an industrial disease like radiation poisoning.
Okay, but did it say anything about taking organs before they decided to even hold an inquest?
That's where things get a little unclear. The law wasn't exactly specific about those details. And then you have the pathologist's obligation to preserve anything related to the cause of death. That was open to interpretation, too. It's almost like they hadn't really thought about the unique challenges that would come with the nuclear age.
So you've got this legal gray area, and then in 1961, the Human Tissue Act comes along. Did that clear things up?
It did address hospital postmortems. You needed consent to remove organs for research. Then again, the guidance on consent for research in coronial cases was still vague. It's like this lack of clarity opened the door for practices that today we'd consider completely unethical.
Okay, so we've got science pushing the limits, laws trying to catch up, and families left completely in the dark. And then you have Dr. Jeffrey Schofield, the guy who really pushed this organ analysis program at Sellafield. He seems like a fascinating but controversial figure.
Oh, he was brilliant, no doubt about that. A real scientist who wanted to understand how radiation affects the human body. But his methods for getting those organs were definitely ethically questionable. He would talk directly to pathologists and coroners, often bypassing any real consent procedures.
He even wanted to make a national post-mortem registry like the U.S. Transuranium Registry. What was he thinking?
Seems like he imagined this huge database that could help refine radiation dose. Estimates track long-term health effects and maybe even protect workers in the future. But this idea of a registry without strong consent protocols, even people within the industry push back against that.
So Dr. Schofield is our ambitious scientist operating in this hazy legal and ethical landscape. But he wasn't alone, right? What about all the other people involved? The pathologists, the coroners, the management at BNFL and the UK ECHO, were they all in on this?
That's where the inquiry gets really interesting. It starts to break down the roles of all these different people and institutions, and you see this whole web of actions and inactions that led to this whole practice. Some pathologists gave Dr. Schofield organs without any hesitation, while others weren't so sure.
And the coroners. Did they do their job of really looking into these cases and making sure that taking the organs was justified?
That's a big question the inquiry tries to answer. We'll see some cases where coroners seem to just take a hands-off approach, which makes you wonder if they really understood how complex radiation exposure is and whether they were really protecting the rights of the workers and their families.
Sounds like the perfect recipe for ethical violations. You've got this pressure to get data, a lack of clear rules, and the system that wasn't really protecting the people who died and their families.
Right. And that takes us to the heart of it all, the real human cost of these practices. We'll look at specific cases that show how devastating this was for families who were kept in the dark, only to find out years later that their loved ones' organs were taken without their knowledge or consent.
It's just a complete betrayal of trust on so many levels. And it makes you wonder if this could happen in cases like Malcolm Pattinson's, where it's not even clear if it was justified what was happening in cases where radiation exposure was a known factor. Did families have a choice?
Sadly, the inquiry found that even when radiation was a potential cause of death, informed consent was often missing. Unfortunately, it wasn't always there. Take the case of John Simpson, another worker at Sellafield. His pathologist specifically said they removed organs for the coroner. But get this, the coroner held the inquest just 2 days after the postmortem.
2 days. There's no way they could have analyzed those organs that quickly. It's like the coroner didn't even care about the results, even though radiation might have been a factor in his death.
Yeah, that lack of follow-through from some coroners is something you see a lot in the inquiry. It points to a bigger problem in the system where they didn't properly investigate potential workplace hazards and protect the rights of workers and their families.
So we see cases where families were totally left out of the loop. But were there any instances where they at least tried to get consent, even if it wasn't exactly how we do things today?
There's the case of James Connor, who worked at Aldermaston. His organs were analyzed for a legitimate reason for the coroner. But Dr. Schofield sent copies of confidential reports to BNFL's legal department.
So even when they followed the procedure, there were still things happening behind the scenes that raised ethical questions.
Exactly. It makes you wonder what their real priorities were. Were they really focused on worker safety and understanding the effects of radiation, or were there other motives driving their actions?
That's a question that keeps coming up throughout the inquiry. That lack of transparency just breeds suspicion and erodes public trust. And then to make things even more complicated, there's the case of Robert McLean, a health physics monitor. His case shows just how uncertain they were about radiation dose assessments, and how that uncertainty could affect compensation claims. So not only were there ethical issues with consent and transparency, but the science itself wasn't always clear-cut. It seems like all these factors combined to create this feeling of injustice and distrust. What about the families who spoke during the inquiry? What were their experiences like?
For a lot of them, it was incredibly traumatic. Imagine finding out years later that parts of your loved one's body were taken and analyzed without you knowing or agreeing to it. It brought back all the pain and anger and made them feel betrayed. It robbed them of the chance to say goodbye properly.
It's a violation that goes way beyond the physical. It's a violation of their trust, their grief, their right to make decisions about their loved one's remains. You can read their testimonies in the report, and it's truly heartbreaking. It really shows the human cost of these practices.
And their stories highlight the need for a more humane approach to scientific research. One that sees the people behind the data, respects their dignity, and prioritizes transparency and open communication.
Absolutely. We can't just treat this as some historical event, some unfortunate chapter that's closed. The ethical questions raised by the Redfern Inquiry are still relevant today, especially as science keeps advancing and we face new challenges in fields like genetics, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. How do we make sure the mistakes of the past aren't repeated? What lessons did the UK learn from all of this? What safeguards are in place now?
Well, after the inquiry revealed all of this, there was a huge public outcry. People were understandably angry, and they demanded change. The documentary Deadly Experiments really brought the issue to light. And then the revelations from other inquiries like Alder Hey and Bristol, which showed similar things happening in other medical settings, just added fuel to the fire. People wanted accountability.
It was a real turning point. It became clear that the old way of doing things was just not acceptable. What concrete steps did they take to address this systemic failure?
One of the biggest outcomes was the creation of the Human Tissue Authority. This independent body is responsible for regulating everything to do with human tissue, making sure that ethical and legal standards are met. They developed clear codes of practice, which lay out the rules for anyone handling human tissue.
So it's not a free-for-all anymore. There's a watchdog in place to prevent abuse and make sure this never happens again. That's reassuring, at least from a regulatory standpoint. But what about the culture within institutions like BNFL? Has there been a real change from the secrecy and questionable ethics that the inquiry exposed?
They've definitely tried to be more transparent and accountable, but changing a culture takes time and effort. It's not just about checking boxes and following rules. It's about creating an environment where ethical considerations are part of every decision, every research project, every interaction with people and their families.
It's about moving beyond just compliance to a culture of genuine respect and ethical awareness. And that requires constant vigilance, open dialogue, and a willingness to learn from past mistakes.
And that's why stories like the ones we've heard today are so important. They remind us of what can happen when we forget about our ethical obligations. They push us to be better, to do better.
It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of new scientific discoveries and technologies. But the Redfern Inquiry reminds us that we can't sacrifice human dignity and basic rights in the pursuit of knowledge.
And this isn't just about the nuclear industry. These ethical dilemmas pop up everywhere in medicine, genetics, AI. As science keeps advancing, we need to be ready to face these challenges with wisdom, compassion, and a strong commitment to ethical principles.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at a dark chapter in the history of the UK nuclear industry, a story that raises some serious questions about science, ethics, and justice.
It's unsettling and makes you think, but it challenges us to think critically about the choices we make both individually and as a society. It emphasizes the importance of holding those in power accountable, speaking up for what's right, and demanding a future where scientific progress goes hand in hand with ethical responsibility.
So we've talked about the science, the legal side of things, and we've heard from the families who were betrayed by a system that seemed to care more about research than their rights. Where do we go from here? Did the Redfern Inquiry offer any kind of closure, any path towards justice?
Well, the inquiry did make a number of recommendations. They called for clearer legal frameworks, documented policies, and solid consent procedures, basically taking the guesswork out of what was allowed and making sure families were informed and involved every step of the way.
There's no more ethical gray areas.
Right. They also stressed the need for better communication with families, not just telling them what happened, but really respecting their wishes and ensuring they understood the results of any analysis. Imagine having to fight just to find out what happened to your loved one's remains. That basic respect was missing in so many of these cases.
Yeah, and of course the Human Tissue Authority was created in response to the inquiry's findings. It's like they said, we need a watchdog to make sure this never happens again.
Yeah.
But did the inquiry address holding people accountable? Were there any individuals who faced consequences for their actions?
That's tough. There's no easy answer. Some families got financial compensation, but many felt that real justice meant holding individuals responsible, acknowledging the harm, and taking steps to prevent it from happening again.
It's that classic debate. Can you really have justice without someone being held responsible? Societies struggle with that all the time. But beyond the legal and financial aspects, there's the emotional impact. How do you fix that shattered trust, that sense of betrayal that these families experienced?
That's where apologies come in. Real heartfelt apologies. It's about admitting wrongdoing, expressing remorse, and promising to do better. Words can't erase the pain, but they can be a start towards healing.
It's about validating their experiences, acknowledging that what happened was wrong. Apologies aside, what's being done now to make sure this doesn't happen again? We talked about the Human Tissue Authority, but has the culture really changed within these institutions?
That's the big question, isn't it? There's been a push for transparency and accountability. But changing a culture takes time. It's not just about following the rules. It's about making ethical considerations part of every decision, every project, every interaction with people and their families.
So moving beyond just compliance to a culture of respect and ethical awareness. And that takes constant work, open communication, and a willingness to learn from the past.
And that's why stories like the ones we've discussed today are so important. They remind us what can happen when we lose sight of our ethical obligations. They push us to be better.
It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of scientific progress, but the Redfern Inquiry is a reminder that we can't sacrifice human dignity and basic rights for the sake of knowledge.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the nuclear industry. These ethical issues come up in so many fields: medicine, genetics, artificial intelligence. We need to be ready to deal with them as science keeps moving forward.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored a dark part of the UK nuclear industry, a story that raises some tough questions about science, ethics, and justice.
It's a story that makes you think. It challenges us to look at the choices we make and the importance of holding those in power accountable. It's about demanding a future where scientific progress and ethical responsibility go hand in hand.
If there's one thing I hope you take away from all of this, it's this: never be afraid to ask questions. When you hear about some new scientific breakthrough, don't just accept it at face value. Dig deeper. Ask about the ethical implications, the potential risks, the impact on people and communities, because as we've seen, progress without ethics can have devastating consequences.
And remember, knowledge is power. The Redfern Inquiry Report is a public document. I encourage you to read it yourself, explore the individual stories, the recommendations, the lessons learned. It's not an easy read, but it's an important one.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. The pursuit of knowledge is important, but it always needs to be guided by a strong ethical compass.
Thank you for listening to the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Remember, you can find more information on the website inquestsandinquiries.com or on the YouTube channel as well. Link in the notes.